Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Well, today is Monday. Joe is a little busy, so we have a special guest to join us. David Daoud, my friend and colleague at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. David focuses on Lebanon, Hezbollah, and all things related in the Middle East. David, welcome to Generation Jihad.
Thank you again for having me, Bill.
Oh, always a pleasure, David. Looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise.
We got a lot of things going on up north. We're gonna take a look at Israel's fight against Hezbollah. Let's just start right there, David. Let's give us an update on the fighting there. It's just a constant, everyday battle between Israel and Iran's proxy, Hezbollah. I've seen reports of it recently of attacks on military command there, and the IDF said it killed a senior Hezbollah operative. They described him as the Hezbollah's force built up unit, which I have no idea what that means, but sounds interesting. So what's going on, David?
Look, if we go back about a month now, and this is something that Israeli news actually had put up statistics today about Hezbollah's attacks for the past month, there's been a noticeable increase in the lethality, the frequency, the range of some of these attacks. And this kind of goes back to, again, early May. A colleague of ours, Ahmad Sharawi, and I tracked it to kind of a two-pronged axis, if you will. Israel's involvement in Rafah, on the one hand, kind of is the prompt for Hezbollah to act, and then the degree of, or at least deepened Israeli involvement in Gaza in general, is this prompt for Hezbollah to act, and you can trace this pattern that I'm about to describe going back to October 8th when Hezbollah entered the fight. So Hezbollah will act, period, when Israel acts in Gaza, and then the depth to which Hezbollah is willing to go is dictated by the state of U.S.-Israel relations. Because as they understand it, not altogether inaccurately, that Israel depends on the United States for weapons resupply, for diplomatic support, to grant international legitimacy, or to at least shore up international legitimacy for Israel's military actions. So the more freedom of action, the more U.S. support, the more Israel has freedom of action, and the less freedom of action that Hezbollah has. And the inverse is also true. So starting in early May, that's when we got reports. I think it was first in Axios that the United States had halted certain weapons shipments to the Israelis. The next day, the Israelis start operating in Rafah. Right? They give the orders for evacuations to start. You start seeing limited operations in eastern Rafah. After that, they took the Rafah crossing, the Philadelphia corridor, at least began to, and U.S.-Israel tensions began to increase as in the aftermath. Right, the United States doubled down on the halt to the weapons shipments. President Biden, had that interview on CNN where he made it very clear that this was his red line. And that this would now, Israeli operation in Rafah would not be acceptable from the U.S. perspective. So there you have, the Gaza action, the Rafah operations prompting Hezbollah to act, and then U.S.-Israel tensions. All of a sudden, you see Hezbollah attacks that have been, like I said, unprecedented in their frequency, in their lethality. We saw attacks as deep as 35 kilometers into Israel, striking the Golani Junction at one point. We saw the introduction of new weapons, right? The Jihad rocket being fired at Israel in mid-May. Same thing with the S-5 missile. I think that was a drone-launched missile. So, and if you go back all the way to October 8th, you kind of see this pattern that Hezbollah started off tepidly, intervening in the war because Israel became involved in Gaza. This is on the assumption that the more attention, the more resources that Israel is devoted to Gaza, the less it can devote to Hezbollah. And then as you start to see U.S.-Israel tensions begin to crystallize and manifest themselves publicly, you start to see this increase in Hezbollah, the range of its attacks, the lethality of its attacks, introduction of new weapons. And so we've seen this pattern replicate itself again now in the past month on a much larger scale. Since President Biden's speech, basically calling for an Israeli ceasefire in Gaza, basically setting the metrics or the endpoint for the Israeli war in Gaza, you've seen yet another increase in Hezbollah's attacks, particularly over the weekend. So the theory is adding up, right? The theory that Ahmed and I had when we trace it along these two metrics, it's adding up, and we're seeing this continue. So we're seeing more of this now. We're seeing an intensification of Hezbollah's attacks because they feel they can, and they feel that they can get away with it with a relative degree of impunity. That, they can hit the Israelis hard, they can make them bleed, and the Israelis will not be able to respond fully in kind. Right? Hezbollah itself, Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah has said on several occasions that even a single one of these attacks that Hezbollah has launched since October 8th would have in the past been enough for Israel to launch a war. Now, there's a bit of exaggeration. Obviously, he wants to make it look like, the big bad resistance is deterring Israel. But there's also a large element of truth to it. There have been over 1,000 attacks, right? Maybe close to 2,000 attacks by now. Several Israelis killed, right? The evacuation of the north, bringing economic and civilian life in the north to a standstill, massive damage to infrastructure. Israel has the justification to go to war, but again, the limitations on its freedom of action from international pressure, particularly from the United States, allows Hezbollah that freedom of action to continue hitting harder and not expecting, the commensurate Israeli response.
Yeah, David, I actually agree with Nasrallah that I don't think it's an exaggeration. Okay, maybe not any one of these attacks, but 2, 3, 4 of them would certainly have prompted an Israeli response far greater than what we've seen. Now, Israel is certainly constrained both internationally, but it also is constrained because it's engaged in Gaza as well. So I think there's both external and internal pressures that are limiting Israel here. Is the Biden administration's policies? I think you alluded to this. Threatening or actually holding up shipments of weapons, failure to veto anti-Israeli UN resolution, constant criticism of Israeli operations, et cetera, et cetera. Is this encouraging Nasrallah and Hezbollah to launch more attacks in your estimation?
I believe so. Look, there's an internal dynamic to the Israeli-Hezbollah war. It's had an internal dynamic since its onset in the early 1980s. No one's denying that, right? Israel makes Hezbollah bleed. Hezbollah wants to make Israel bleed back. But what we saw I like to compare two scenarios to kind of show where Hezbollah has been for the past, give or take, 5 years, right? In August of 2019, Israel conducts a strike in Syria, killing 2 Hezbollah operatives. Nasrallah gets on TV and says, if you kill us in Syria, we're going to kill you from Lebanon. That's the equation that he set. Shortly thereafter, I think it was August 31st or September 1st, 2019, Hezbollah conducts an attack with an anti-tank guided missile targeting what it thought was an IDF vehicle in Moshav Avivim in the north. Right? It turned out that it wasn't, but Hezbollah understood, and its leadership articulated this position that every time there's a security interaction of that nature between Hezbollah and Israel, there's a risk to go to war. So they were willing to take that risk. They were willing to risk killing Israeli soldiers, and they were willing to risk the consequences of killing Israeli soldiers, which in the past has led these two these two belligerent parties to war. Fast forward a month, October 17th, 2019 happens. This is when Lebanon's economic crisis, explodes, and the country collapses financially. After that, Hezbollah starts to act in a much more circumspect manner. Right, the Israelis do violate that red line more than once. They kill Hezbollah fighters in Syria. They also killed one in Lebanon in May 2021. And rather than respond in kind, or according to this equation that they'd set, right? You kill us from in Syria, we'll kill you from Lebanon. All of a sudden, they changed the equation, right? Hezbollah did try a tepid response after one of its fighters was killed in Syria, I think in July of 2020, if I'm not mistaken, Ali Kamal Mohsin. It wasn't this big thing, right? It was like an attempted infiltration on the border. And then the Israelis immediately foiled it, and Hezbollah walked it back and pretended nothing had happened. So they tried to do this very differently, very quietly. And this kind of continued, and they changed the whole equation. They're like, well, really, our strength is demonstrated not by making the Israelis bleed, but by making them, be on alert this entire time. And this continued, right, up until October 8th, 2023. During that time, they'd outsourced direct attacks from Lebanon to Palestinian groups and had been working with Palestinian groups in the West Bank and in Israel itself to make the Israelis bleed. So what changed, right? Because Lebanon's economy is still collapsed. That factor that demotivated Hezbollah from trying to risk a war with Israel, because if you're in that situation, if people are struggling to get food, if your currency has lost 100% of its value, if there's no international aid now, and there definitely won't be international aid after war, you don't want to be seen as the guy who brought, compounded this economic misery with a destructive war of, unprecedented destruction upon them. So that remained, right? October 8th, that still existed. What was it that changed? Part of it was Gaza, but also part of it was, again, Hezbollah understands that Israel, to go to war, and the duration of time that Israel has to go to war, and its ability to, again, bomb things, the very act of engaging in kinetic actions depends on U.S. resupply and depends on U.S. support. So the more you see daylight between the United States and Israel, the more you realize that you have freedom of action, because you can hit and the Israelis can't go to war because they need President Biden's approval. And that is all being taken up on Gaza. And even there, it's stretching the limits, right, of U.S. approval. So if you're Nasrallah, you realize, I can hit the Israelis and I can't overdo it, right? Because if you overdo it, that's when you grant the Israelis legitimacy. If you, fire 100 rockets and they strike a school and you kill 50 school children, it's going to be much harder for the international community to tell Israel, you know what, take this on the chin and move on, right? But if you do these pinprick attacks and you create this situation of constant discomfort for the Israelis, and you ratchet that up gradually, commensurate with the degree of American pressure or American daylight, right? American pressure on Israel or American daylight between Israel and the United States, then you can keep the pressure on the Israelis. You can make them bleed at will, and you're not granting the Israelis the legitimacy that they need to kind of turn to the international community and say, well, what do you want from us at this point? So I think that's the pattern that we've seen. That's kind of what Hezbollah is looking at. Hassan Nasrallah himself has said this. He's different occasions or different times, he's talked about the impact of the United States on Israeli freedom of action. In early January, he talked about the December poll, Harvard CAPS poll that came out that showed that 51% of 18 to 24s in the United States want to dismantle Israel and give it back to the Palestinians and Hamas, right? And Nasrallah said, this is great. This is great development. This will have tremendous impact in the United States. And then in a subsequent speech, he was talking about, the undecided votes in the United States. He was saying, we give our thanks to these people that voted undecided, because as impactful as all the international pressure is on Israel, including from South Africa, right? He was talking about the ICJ case. The American position is decisive, and what happens in America is decisive. And those were his words. What happens in America is decisive. Fast forward again to a subsequent speech. He was sitting there and mocking the idea that Israel controls America. It takes Nasrallah to figure this out for John Mearsheimer, that America is the senior partner in this, and he's saying that this is a nonsensical fantasy. The idea that Israel controls America. When America puts its foot down, Israel takes notice. When America says we're halting weapons shipments, the IDF chief of staff takes out his little notebook and tries to figure out how many artillery shells he has left. So they understand that the United States and its positions are decisive in when it comes to Israel's freedom of action. And again, as I said, the two kind of Hezbollah's freedom of action and Israel's freedom of action kind of work in inverse proportion.
Yeah, Hezbollah has succeeded here in creating a new normal of daily violence, daily attacks, multiple attacks on the border. And the irony is Hezbollah escalated to this point, right? To this new normal. And now if Israel feels the need to respond in order to try and stop this, it's very likely going to get external pressure to not do so, to accept a level of violence that was unacceptable on October 6, 2020 and 23 and prior. I think it's a real, one of the things, David, that I've been watching and that really sort of crystallized for me over the last, I'd say probably last 6 months or so, is how Iran has succeeded in closing the noose around Israel. I go back 20 something years ago, right? You had Hezbollah on the border. Obviously you have the Palestinian groups, right? We fast forward now, you have Iraqi militias that, are launching drone attacks on Israel and can serve as a strategic reserve with hundreds of thousands of fighters if they're so employed. And Syrian militias as well. You have the Houthis taking hot shots at shipping, disrupting shipping, and also firing drones and cruise and ballistic missiles against Israel. And then there's even talk of a Jordanian Islamic resistance, which again, no evidence of it, but it was threatened by the Iraqi militias. And given what we've witnessed over the last 20 plus years, I don't rule it out. The loss of Jordan would be a massive blow to the Israelis. They'd be fully surrounded at that point in time. And, this has become the new normal for Israel. And how does Israel even roll this back?
It's a good question. I think you've described something that we've seen rolled out during this current conflict, and we'll touch on Jordan in a bit because I think that's critical. But we may have discussed this ourselves on the show before, but kind of the concentric circles of pressure, and they're not all kinetic, right? So you have the direct circles of pressure on Israel itself from Hezbollah, from Hamas, obviously, and the Palestinian militias from the West Bank, the Iraqi militias when their attacks are actually real and not imaginary. This is another layer of attack. So there is this kind of making the Israelis bleed directly. But then you have this secondary circle, which is directed against, and it's still kinetic, right? And this is the Iraqi militias when they were targeting U.S. forces in the region. And there was a report recently that they may suspend their suspension of the attacks. So they may resume attacks. Targeting Jordan, right? Our colleague Ahmad Sharawi recently penned an article that I recommend that everyone read on Iran's attempts to destabilize Jordan through, domestic forces and external forces as well. Like you said, this would be a tremendous blow, not just to Israel, but to the West generally.
Yeah, United States as well. Jordan is a major partner. Yeah.
Major partner. It's a pillar of regional stability. Imagine if the country, you don't even need to make it fall. If you just, make it teeter, and have it, have the Hashemite monarchy start to be forced to take into consideration, every time it wants to side with the West, or every time it wants to do what's in its broader interest of working with the Israelis or cooperating on security matters or what have you, you have to worry about, a domestic group that is aligned to some degree with Iran over the issue of Israel that Iran can then activate and cause trouble for you. And it doesn't, again, you're not talking about like suicide bombings or something. You just need to create domestic unrest. And then there's a third circle that I think, and also the Houthis, right? Obviously the Houthis attacks on international shipping. So then it's not just, Israel that's paying a price for fighting the Gaza war. You're making the United States, you're making the international community, you're making moderate Arab states pay the price for a direct price for the continuation of this war, right? You will also bleed so long as Israel is fighting in Gaza. And there's the third layer, and this is something that I wrote about for LWJ, the hearts and minds component, right? Working on turning international opinion against Israel's existence, period. Definitely against the war. And this is something, again, Nasrallah talked about this on November 3rd, where he did talk about kind of different layers of pressure. He's like, anyone who can write, who can protest, who can speak. So they're not just talking about kinetic action. They're talking about, Israel's support, Israel's global home is among Western democracies. Western democracies are uniquely amenable to influence. It's something that I've often mulled. How can a democracy actually inoculate itself against information campaigns? An autocracy can, right? Because you have a closed information system. The premise of our society is that we have the open exchange of information. Now, that allows a lot of good information and a lot of good, the marketplace of ideas to hash things out, but it also opens a door for the injection of narratives by autocratic state actors. And this sounds a little conspiratorial, except if we go back to March of 2021, the Biden administration's ODNI had released a report talking about foreign election interference. The Russians, they said, were kind of pressing on the scale for former President Trump. And the Iranians and Hezbollah were doing the same, but for President Biden, right? So they have the ability to inject themselves into the conversation, to spread narratives within the conversation. And it's not just in the United States, right? They did this in Israel during the judicial overhaul, in particular, to exacerbate right-left tensions. And I remember one incident where they had one Iranian information operation had created almost this fake personality of like a religious Zionist rabbi. And, if you're not part of the religious Zionist community, you probably aren't familiar if these figures are accurate or not, right? If these are real figures or not. And he was saying inflammatory stuff about, secular and other Jews. And, you'd see the opposite, fake left-wing accounts saying all this stuff about Prime Minister Netanyahu and his supporters. The idea was just to kind of keep the Israelis at each other's throats. So the Iranians have this ability, right? And they've perfected information warfare the way I've traced it, 1985 to 2000, and been using it since. They are also allied with the Russians and the Chinese, who have expertise in this. And I mean, this is something going back to something Nasrallah said. The method of, when he talked about the 18 to 24s that I mentioned earlier, he said this is something that needs to be worked on. It's good and needs to be worked on because it'll have tremendous impact in America. He's like, the way to do this is basically social media. He's like, the West created social media to destroy Islam. Well, now we're going to flip the tool on its makers. And if you think about it, there's a lot of these, so I guess they call them social media influencers, basically these accounts, and then real people, Rania Khalek, right? Hadi Nasrallah, Maram Susli, Partisan Girl, right? There's all these people that kind of emerged out of the disinformation cesspool, if you will, during the Syrian civil war, and amassed massive followings. And, all you need to do is put out a certain narrative, right? And you have ideologically aligned people in the West who will pick up that narrative and magnify it. It doesn't necessarily need to be this coordinated effort. It's that simple. And where I've noticed is that it's not just, the meta narrative that is being parroted by some circles in the West. It's the specifics, right? When Nasrallah talks about the Israeli military failure to accomplish anything in Gaza, alleged, and this is obviously, when he talks about how this once powerful army was able to defeat 3 Arab armies in 6 days, and now it can't defeat teeny tiny, poor Hamas in 8 months, and how this demonstrates that Israel is no longer the power it used to be, which is nonsense if you really understand how warfare works at all. But then you see this narrative being parroted, right? And not just by bots, by people who seem to be real. So there is that element as well. And if you get those people, if you get enough people in the West to see things your way, come voting time, that vote matters. and you have protests and different pressure mechanisms that a democracy allows. So this is kind of the part, I would call it part of that ring that you're describing. And it seems like it all, it's been in preparation for some time, or at least the Iranians and their proxies have identified these pressure nodes for some time. And now that this war has happened, they've unrolled it all at once, and the Israelis have been on their back heel, partially because I think a democracy is inherently at a disadvantage when it comes to these things, because democracies don't really wage information warfare, and they certainly can't do it well. And the Israelis are particularly bad at narrative. They're particularly bad at explaining their side of the narrative. So all of this kind of happened at once, and the Israelis are still on their back heel against this interlocking, multi-tiered Iranian pressure mechanism.
Yeah, you hit a couple of points there. I'm just nodding my head as you're talking. The Israelis are really bad at narratives. I'm continually shocked at how bad their information campaigns are. But here we are. You would think by the 21st century, one quarter of it by, they would get it, but they don't. They just cede so much ground. But the other thing is the Palestinians, the Iranians, they have a narrative that's simplistic and that sticks, right? Colonialism, Zionism, the resistance.
Baby murderers, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? And it feeds into the segments in the West that kick this up. And, you recently had Al-Qaeda come out and be supportive of the protesters here in the United States. And you gotta sit here, and I was talking to a friend, and I'm saying, look, you got Iran, you got Al-Qaeda, backing the Palestinians, but then you turn around and you look at this information space that you're talking about in the social media, and there was a poll out that 30% of, young adults, I think it was ages 18 to 25, I forget what the age range was, but we're maybe Osama bin Laden, was on to something.
Right. Was right. Yeah,
so
he was right.
I can't even, to 1/3 of the American public of that age range, I can't even make the argument. Hey, look, if Al-Qaeda is, saying this is a good thing, maybe you need to rethink it, because they might be inclined to view Al-Qaeda.
To agree even more. Yeah. Because Al-Qaeda was fighting the evil empire.
Right.
Yeah. And look, you have bigger powers like China and Russia. Look, I think the Chinese and the Russians are agnostic when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian issue or any issue. They're pure interest driven. But for them, they want to weaken U.S. influence in the Middle East, which is a critical territory, because it's a central shipping region, resource rich. There's a massive population there. If you're trying to tip the global scales of power against your main geopolitical and geostrategic adversary, the United States, you want as many people on board as possible. The Arab side of the equation can offer the Russians and the Chinese something the Israelis never can. Right? Israel's already an ally of the United States. So the more you weaken Israel, the more you weaken in the region, the more you weaken the United States in the region. But, the Israelis can't exactly switch teams either, because there's 9 million of them, and there's, almost 500 million Arabs in a broader Muslim world. And that, if you get almost 2 billion people, if we're talking about the broader Muslim world on your side, what's 9 million? Right. And that's much more of a push against the United States. So do you have an interest in not just turning America against one of its chief allies, and in a particularly strategic area, but also contributing to tearing American society apart or creating fissures within American society itself? Because this is something that I've said, what kind of an America is it that would turn its back on Israel? Right, that would say we are no longer allies with the Israelis. And we know the types of countries that in the past that have said, you know what, we don't want this country. We want to deal with the other side of things. We are allies with the other side. They're not exactly, the champions or the guardians of continuity of Western civilization. And again, if you are Russia, and if you are China, you don't have an interest in Western civilization's perpetuation or its strength or its dominance. You want, that is the underpinning of the global order that keeps you as Russia and China restrained. You want that gone, so you can just run roughshod. So would you throw your weight behind this as well? I think, and again, you have these massive state capabilities to do so. TikTok, uh, uh, bots on Twitter, what have you. Massive media apparatuses that spread disinformation, websites. So you have the ability to do this. You have the ability to weaken the United States through doing so. And yeah, what's more important than convincing our future generation that the country in which they live is the greatest menace to the good, to human, to humanity? That the United States is the biggest threat to humanity.
Yeah, that you certainly have a big segment of our population now or should I say significant segment that thinks that way. And how do we turn that around? Can we turn that around with the social media environment? How people have been brainwashed to this idea of the Israeli state being the bad guys here, and it's
not just the bad guys, but kind of the when you hear that conspiracy theories. I mean, this is like classical anti-Semitism, but the idea that Israel is somehow the cause of police violence even in the United States because the Israelis have militarized our police. So, if you draw the conclusion, then every BLM and what it was complaining about was really an Israeli sin, not an American sin, right? So all of your problems, right? The Jew is our misfortune in a certain way. And yeah, why wouldn't you? If you are convinced that Israel is kind of the font or the fount of all this evil, then why wouldn't you go after it? Why wouldn't you fight it with all your, you would solve all the world's problems. We would have racial harmony here in the United States if it weren't for the Israelis.
Yeah, one thing this war has should have completely dispelled, but doesn't seem to, is that the Jews control the media, right? Well, if they do, man, they're doing a terrible job.
I know.
So
I know.
This makes no sense. David, I'm going to turn back real quick to Hezbollah here specifically. Is the ongoing fighting and the threat of a full-blown war between Israel and Hezbollah, is that putting pressure internally on Hezbollah?
There are three ways, I guess, Hezbollah can retain support. And I'm using support broadly. You have the people that are actually convinced, and you have the people that are just indifferent, and you have the people that are willing to go along out of fear, right? As long as you're willing to go along, be it out of conviction, indifference, or fear, then you're not a problem, right? If I can terrify you, and it doesn't take much for Hezbollah to terrify you. The times that you've had people kind of come out and speak out, especially from within the Shia population, right? Because this is Hezbollah's base. You start seeing cracks in that base. That's a threat to Hezbollah. They brought the hammer down. In 2017, there was this neighborhood in Beirut called Hayy Silom. You had these kiosks, poor people, right? This is a very poor neighborhood. You had these illegal kiosks where people were selling wares there. And as part of a municipal cleanup operation, Hezbollah was involved in. These kiosks were all destroyed, right? They were torn down. And again, this is lawful, but this is these people's livelihood on the other hand. So you had people come out and start to curse Nasrallah explicitly, right? FU, things like that. The Arabic Lebanese equivalent of FU. Hezbollah brought their entire apparatus down on them, right? A bunch of poor, indigent, helpless shopkeepers. Why? Because that can't exist. That's Hezbollah's base. That's their bread and butter. You start allowing cracks in that. You start allowing, Hezbollah's base to curse at Hezbollah. And, after they brought the hammer down on them, the same people who had gone on TV and cursed Nasrallah went on Al-Manar and one by one issued an apology to Hassan Nasrallah, kissed the ring. Do they personally hate him? They probably hate him 10 times more after all that, right? But does it matter? Because they have been forced to fall in line. So as long as Hezbollah is able to maintain that support, indifference, or fear, then, they're fine.
Yeah, and the fact that they went on television to apologize, that sends the message to everyone else.
Exactly.
They all know the hammer's been put down. Well, David, let's turn to the ceasefire proposal from President Biden. I've been trying to figure out what's going on here. Maybe you can help me cut through the fog, if you can, indeed. What is the Biden administration's ceasefire proposal? What's the Israeli position? And have we heard anything from Hamas?
So, where do we start?
Yeah,
on this?
right.
Because
Sorry about that question.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. Because President Biden's speech, I mean, at least as far as I'm concerned, came out of nowhere. At least the proposals that were included, this idea of a permanent ceasefire. And when we talk about what a permanent ceasefire means, objectively speaking, it's the idea that Hamas is going to accept, even begrudgingly, even with hatred in its heart, but at least accept Israel's existence, not its right to, but its existence, and say that we are never going to cross the border in any way, shape, or form. Right? We're going to stay on our side and do our thing, and you can stay on your side and you do your thing. We'll shoot each other nasty glances from time to time, but we will never fight each other again. That's nonsense, right? Anyone who has even as I say that, I want to call that nonsense, because there's no possibility that Hamas accepts such a situation, even this coldest of cold pieces, right? Because that's what a permanent ceasefire means. It means a cold, icy, but peace, nevertheless. So that's the starting point of where the Biden administration's ceasefire proposal was going. That you'd have the kind of this trial period where hostages would be released, and then you would have a permanent ceasefire that would see the Israelis withdraw from Gaza, that would see rebuilding of Gaza, and that Hamas, whatever, they're left, right? And President Biden kind of tried to cover this over by saying, well, Hamas has been degraded enough, and total victory. There's this subtweet basically in there where he's like, total victory is not achievable. So, and all this would happen again, not for Hamas surrendering unconditionally. Sorry, speaking of Hezbollah, they were just firing rockets. But none of this would happen in exchange for Hamas surrendering unconditionally, laying down its arms, disbanding, giving up its governing power. The idea is, no, Hamas has been dealt enough of a blow to where they can never threaten Israel again. Now, this is patently fictional, because what we've seen, especially over the past few weeks, higher number of Israeli casualties in Gaza, and these guys aren't slipping downstairs, right? They're dying, they're falling in combat, which means that Hamas, while degraded, is not gone. And again, anyone who thought that October 7th, we knew the Israelis were going to respond. We knew it was going to be a war. Anyone who had any common sense realized this isn't going to be business as usual after what happened. But anyone who thought that Hamas's destruction could be accomplished in one fell swoop, given the massive apparatus they built up in Gaza, given their intertwining with the civilian population, given the 300 miles plus tunnel. I was reading something recently that the Japanese bedeviled invading U.S. forces in Iwo Jima with 11 miles of tunnel, right? 300 plus miles of tunnel is the biggest tunnel infrastructure in history, as far as I know. And you've had almost 20 years since 2005, since the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, to build up this military infrastructure. This is not something that's going to happen in one fell swoop. No, urban-centric campaign against a group that uses hybrid guerrilla conventional methods like Hamas has ever been accomplished in one fell swoop. You always have an initial push that's followed by a degree of insurgency and then a counterinsurgency, right? It's a slow erosion process. And we're seeing that erosion process is still ongoing, as demonstrated by, these heightened clashes, resulting in more Israeli casualties. And that's not to mention Rafah, where, yes, Israeli operations have been intensifying in Rafah. The Israelis have seized the Philadelphia corridor. Again, the erosion process against Hamas is starting there, but the 4 battalions that remain there have not been rendered operational. They're still fighting. So if you leave this, if Israel gets its 120 hostages back tomorrow and withdraws in 6 weeks, right? and there's no fighting in between. And then you go to a permanent ceasefire. Those remnants of Hamas will reconstitute. They will form a nucleus around which not just Hamas, but these other terrorist groups that are allied with Hamas will reconstitute. And there's going to be an internal process where Hamas starts to recruit, retrain. They have domestic weapons manufacturing capabilities. They have know-how to build those capabilities. But you also have interested regional actors, namely Iran, Hezbollah, right? The resistance axis militias that will help Hamas reconstitute, because as we talked about earlier, right, this ring of fire that Iran is building around the Israelis. Gaza is a critical part of that. So leaving them intact really just kicks the bucket down the road to another 10-7 in a matter of years. This is not the permanent ceasefire by any means that the Biden administration was talking about. There's also a Lebanon component that was, well, if we solve Gaza, then we can fix, we can end this stuff on Lebanon. Except you look at the proposals that the Biden administration has for Lebanon. They're based on resolving the outstanding border disputes, money for the Lebanese, for talk of gradual implementation of Resolution 1701. I have no idea how that's going to happen, right? Because that would depend on the Lebanese distancing Hezbollah at least north of the Litani, and then disarming the group, which is not ever going to happen. And the assumption is that this will happen if you strengthen the LAF. It's not a matter of LAF's numbers or training; it's a matter of will. Because what we talked about just a second ago, Hezbollah's support base. You try to go forcibly disarm a group that has, the support of a demographic that could be 30-40% of the country. That's a civil war. And Lebanon is never, his foreign minister said this, they're like, he said, we do this, we're going to civil war. We leave Hezbollah, we're getting regional war. I'll always prefer regional war over civil war because you can't end civil war. That's the Lebanese calculus. And I can't really blame them. Who wants to bring a civil war upon themselves? So the assumption there that, and Hezbollah's issue with Israel isn't a matter of borders, right? It's not a matter of, well, you resolve these 13 points and Hezbollah lays down its arms like, well, Lebanese resistance is done, guys. That was always just a fiction. That was a mask that they were using to build up their arms so they could continue their fight, which is against Israel's very existence. So none of the solutions within, either for Gaza create the conditions for a permanent ceasefire, nor do the ones vis-a-vis Lebanon that we see on the table, because they don't have they're not addressing the core issue, and they don't have enforcement mechanisms that, okay, fine, Hezbollah will never give up the fight against Israel, but you are putting in place pieces, security arrangements that, irrespective of what Hezbollah wants, will prevent it from ever acting on those desires. Neither of these things are true. So you're only creating a situation that'll kick the bucket down the road, buy some quiet for the time being. And what we're going to end up with in 10 years is a war that's even more destructive.
Yeah, the Biden administration seems to desire kicking problems. Look, most administrations do. I'll use Afghanistan as an example. President Obama pushed, wanted out of Afghanistan, pushed it off to the next administration. President Trump's, signed the deal with the Taliban, but never executed on it. And, President Biden hoped to get a decent interval with the U.S. leaving Afghanistan and a delay and collapse. It just didn't work. But yeah, Hezbollah this is not workable, what you just described here. And I openly laughed when you mentioned enforcing Resolution 1701. I mean, you mentioned LAF. That's the Lebanese Armed Forces. It's the perfect acronym for the Lebanese Armed Forces. It's laughable. Enforcing 1701. That's laughable. It's not. These things aren't going to happen. Giving money, continuing to give American taxpayer dollars to the Lebanese Armed Forces, that's laughable because they're not going to enforce Resolution 1701. And we see these as solutions to problems, and they're not. They're exactly as you described it, David. If this agreement is signed, it will kick this problem down the road. Hamas, can it be defeated? One of the things I always heard during the war on terror in Iraq, and you can't kill your way to victory. Sure, you can. It's a matter of will. You have to kill the right people, and you have to kill enough of them. But you can't do that
kill
when
an
you're being
idea.
constrained.
You can't kill an idea, but this is the straw man, right? No victory against the conventional force or non-conventional force, right? We didn't defeat Nazism in World War II as an idea, right? You have neo-Nazis in the United States, of all places, in the countries that sacrificed, hundreds of thousands of people, the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, right? That still believe in this nonsensical ideology. But that didn't stop us from striving for victory. Communism, we did not defeat communism. And in no case, no war in history has an idea or a belief ever been defeated. That's not the objective, right? When you talk about total victory, what you're talking about there is, as we did with Nazis, is to ensure, and with ISIS, right? Did the ISIS ideology die out? Clearly not. And it would be absurd to think, to suggest as a straw man that the objective behind the campaign against ISIS was to destroy its ideology. The objective was to destroy its ability to constitute a threat, considerable threat, either to its surroundings or to the international community.
And on that point, David, I'm going to interrupt you really quick.
Yeah.
But that was denying it territory.
Yeah, exactly.
So that it can
exactly
right, and that's what you need to do here with Hamas. I would argue the same thing with Hezbollah. If you want to defeat Hezbollah, you need to deny them. That, to me, safe haven territory is the key driver. Obviously, the ideology comes first, but if you have the territory to organize, train, recruit, raise money, and then wage war, you're a direct threat. Go on.
No, I was actually going exactly there. That the method to accomplishing that was the destruction of the so-called caliphate. And without that, look, ISIS can still mount, as an ideology, can still mount attacks. Right? It's not like attacks in the name of ISIS globally have stopped, but the threat it poses now is so minuscule compared to what it was prior to the campaign to destroy ISIS. Its existential threat that it posed to its surroundings is gone. Right? The idea that ISIS could launch attacks in Iraq today, right? But they're not. They're no longer at the level where they can conquer and digest and subsume whole parts of Iraq into a putative state. So that's what you need to do with Hamas. The idea that there will never be another shooting attack or suicide attack in the name of Hamas. I don't think anyone meant that by total victory, right? And to suggest that that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu or the Israeli military echelon envisioned from the outset is to create a straw man. But that does not mean that you just, because you can't defeat an idea, you just throw your hands up in defeat and just say, well, we got to live with this. We got to live with this situation where thousands of rockets fall on border communities, where Damocles' sword of another 10-7 just hangs perpetually over the border communities. It's absurd, and kicking the bucket down the road only exacerbates the problem, because by permitting this ideology territory to reconstitute, they're not. As we've learned, they're not just going to remain static, right? They're not just going to say, well, okay, well, you've degraded us down to here, down to 30%. We're going to stay at 30%. No, they're going to take the opportunity to make themselves more lethal. They have more know-how that now they can build off of. And they're going to come back more lethal. And what that means is that the Israeli response is going to be more lethal in the future. And something they've learned now, by the way, is that intertwining themselves with the civilian population works, right? That's the key, because if you're fighting from outside civilian population areas, no one's going to stop the Israelis. But once the international community sees those horrific images of dead babies out of Gaza, and look, the strike that happened in Rafah, I think about a week ago, give or take, right? The Israelis killed 2 senior Hamas operatives with a low-grade munition. And as far as we can tell, I guess there was some shrapnel that either lit a gas tank or, there was a secondary explosion of some sort. There was like some Hamas arsenal or something. And then you had these horrific images coming out of displaced Palestinians being burned alive. And it doesn't like legally, were the Israelis targeting them? Was this a war crime? No, right? This is one of those perhaps, definitely unfortunate and very likely unforeseeable consequences that will happen in war. But try to argue that when, the other side just needs to wave the image of the dead baby.
Yeah, it's the emotional issue,
exactly.
Right? That's
exactly.
These are simplistic narratives.
Exactly. And if you're going to be the guy who's going to argue, conditions of war, laws of armed conflict, errors that happen in war, all of this dry procedural stuff against the image of a dead baby, you've already lost.
Right. On social media, you will lose that argument.
And you lose that argument even in the court of international, not just public opinion on the street, but even in the court of in the halls of power. And this is what's influencing also to a large degree, Israel, the posture of Israel's Western allies, that they're seeing the death toll and these images, and it's creating an impact on them, as it will on any human being who has a conscience. But and we know where this is going. But like, if you have to finish the job, what alternative do you have? So long as you're fighting the war legally, right, per the laws of armed conflict. But even in saying that, right, I can imagine a listener or two thinking, "Wow, that David's a heartless guy."
Yeah, except if there's another war, because Hamas 2, whatever we want to call it, 4.0 arises from the ashes, and this begins again. Look, I'm a proponent of finishing wars and not leaving them to linger, especially after what I witnessed over, the last 20 years. It destroys societies. It increases civilian casualties. I think it's immoral if this ceasefire is implemented and only leads to yet another war between Israel and the Palestinians.
Because all of what would have happened would have been for naught. Might as well just, on October 8th, just say, okay, well, here are the prisoners we have in Israeli jails. Give us the hostages. We'll lick our wounds and wait for you to do this. Yeah, exactly. Wait for you to do this again, right?
David, I'll use Afghanistan, right? If I would have known on September 12th, 2001, that 21 years later, several thousand American dead, Afghanistan largely in ruins, and the Taliban would be back in power with Al-Qaeda running training camps again, would it be worth it? I'd say no. What was the point of that? What would be the point of this?
Yeah. What's the point of all the death? What's the point of, and I question this, about the war that I fought in 2006, that the expectations were such that, at least on our level, right, the level of the combat soldier, that this is going to be a swift victory, that, the political echelon and the military echelon were going to give us the proper backing to go fight a war like we needed to fight a war. And whatever sacrifices were going to be made, and you understand this, Bill, right? Yes, like soldiers are willing to make sacrifices when they're given the tools to win.
Yes.
Whatever sacrifice you're asked to make, then okay, it's worth it, because the cause is worth it, and you're giving me the tools to win. That's all I want as a soldier. And then that war did not go that way. Israel's military efforts were squandered, and then 2 years later, you have Samir Kuntar released anyway, among what I think was 400 other different prisoners and bodies of terrorists and stuff like that, in exchange for Ehud Goldwasser and Eldad Regev's bodies, not even living people. And I couldn't help but wonder to myself in 2008, well, then why the hell did we do all this, right? Why did I lose my friends in Lebanon? Why did I fight at all? Why did we cause all this destruction on the other side? If at the end of the day we're going to do what we're going to just do this anyway. We're just going to
all for naught. Yeah, and how many other wars has Israel fought since then, right? Politicians, they somehow seem to think we could afford to just keep kicking the can down the road. Israel's national security advisor said that on May 29th, he said that the war in Gaza is likely to last through the end of the year. So another 7 months, right? 8 months, whatever. And even then, I think this is optimistic if the goal is to actually put Hamas in a state that it couldn't reorganize. This ceasefire, the Israelis, if they sign off on this is exactly, in my opinion, what they'd be doing what they've done in the past. And like you said, it would be all for naught.
I think there's that the Israelis have pushed back. Prime Minister Netanyahu today, I think he told the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee that not everything the Biden administration said was accurate, or that President Biden said rather was accurate, and that the objective remains, no permanent cessation to the war and destruction of Hamas's military and governing capabilities. There's also this more cryptic tweet thread that the Prime Minister's office put out after the president's announcement. And then, I saw a news flash on my phone, one of these news updates, that the White House responded and said, no, the way we presented the Israeli plan was entirely accurate. My read is that they're basically, look, you come out and you say the Israelis have accepted a permanent ceasefire. All right, the Israelis are not just have accepted, they are offering, the offer that they're putting on the table is a permanent ceasefire. It becomes very hard to you push the Israelis into a corner. I don't think they would have said that. It's just, that they would have to be, to have some kind of multiple personality disorder to go from what they were saying the day before, in fact, the day of, to this, right? And given the objectives of the war that have not been accomplished yet. But I think from the Biden administration standpoint, this puts the Israelis in a lose-lose. If the Israelis accept, then war is over. But if they try to reject, then they look like the spoil sports. They look like they're the ones that want to continue this war. And from Hamas, right? Hamas was excited about this. Reuters, I think, put out a report shortly after President Biden's speech where Hamas was like, "Yeah, this is great." And if I were Hamas, right, this is exactly what I want. And I would be on my best behavior, because as Hamas, you want to survive, right? You want to take away Israel's excuse to continue, because you realize that it's a matter of time. If the Israelis are able to continue this fight, it's a matter of time. It's 6 months, 7 months, however long it is, but it is a matter of time until Israel ends Hamas's ability to operate militarily or governmentally. So you want this deal. Israelis don't. But yeah, if the Israelis in pushing back now they're kind of in a bind. How do you push back against this without looking like
they want to continue the war? Yeah. Which they do. And this is part of, back to what we were talking about briefly earlier, right? This is part of the messaging problem. The Israelis need to be consistent. And you're even seeing some division within the war cabinet on this issue, on how this should be dealt with, right? What is the end state? All of these things. We don't see that with Hamas. We don't see that with Hamas and its patron Iran, or, we don't see this between Hamas and Hezbollah, or Hezbollah and Iran. Whatever differences they have, they keep them.
They have them close to the chest. Yeah,
exactly. The way you should do it. And I put a lot of the blame on the Biden administration, because honestly, the Biden administration should stand by and let the Israelis do what they need to do. And instead, they're trying to constrain and restrain the Israelis. And, this is why we're getting, and President Biden is, feeling political pressure here. He feels he needs to put an end to this war, but it's not acceptable to the Israelis. And that's the bind that the two parties are in.
And I think what you're seeing in Israel is, to a large part, kind of an outgrowth, in that, look, we understand this as Americans. After 9/11 happened, you take a blow like that, and in a country as big as the United States, I mean, people were affected who'd never been to New York, right? Who'd never known a New York, perhaps. But even there, the idea that our country was attacked, from standpoint of morale, you need an image of victory. You need a victory. And the longer it takes to get that victory image, the more the old fissures, right? There's a certain, I don't want to call it an artificial unity, but there's a temporary unity that happens in moments of national disaster. And that can only carry you so long or so far without image of victory, without kind of, that time President Bush being able to deliver certain things. You started to see the cracks that existed before reemerge. And you're starting to see that in Israel. And not only that, you're starting to see an erosion of Israeli morale. I saw a poll that came out maybe last month that something like 33% of Jewish Israelis were starting to question whether Israel is where they wanted to raise their kids. And it's because, why would you want to raise your kids in a country that can't defend itself against a ragtag militia group? And, look, the Biden administration, right, kind of the Biden re-election team, rather, is using this as this is obviously all geared towards the November 2024 elections. Will they then, if they win, if the Biden administration wins, kind of throw its full support behind Israel? Is that the strategy? Is that the plan, right? Kind of keep the, play the political game now until November and then give Israel the backing that it deserves and needs. I don't know. If that is the plan, it's a very short-sighted one, because in the meantime, Israeli morale is eroding, and what you're seeing, war cabinet member Benny Gantz, right? He gave Prime Minister Netanyahu an ultimatum until June 8th to kind of accomplish certain metrics, or at least have a plan for certain metrics. One of them was finishing Rafah, right? So it's not like you have this idea that Rafah should be left, but Rafah is not being finished because the Biden administration has been putting impossible bars for months on Israel finishing the job. This war could have, at least this phase, kind of the intensive fighting phase of the war, could have been done maybe. I'm trying to remember when the Israelis basically were ready to go into Rafah. But months ago.
David, I think it was January.
Yeah.
I go back to that point, and then I remember talking to friends and saying, what are we waiting for here, right? They finished up in Gaza City. They, basically severed the country, or segmented the Gaza Strip. And then we're just waiting. And then we started talks of the talk about Rafah, I'm pretty sure was somewhere in the early January timeframe, late December.
That sounds about right.
Almost 5 months squandered.
Yeah. And this could have been done.
The time, we said this, Joe and I, Truzman and I said it, Benham. Time has always been against the Israelis. And the worst thing that this administration could do, Netanyahu, is stretch out the time. But they were so fearful of being cut off from weapons and the U.S. constraints. I always felt that they should just cast that aside and put the pressure on the Biden administration to fish or cut bait. The Israelis have enough weapon stocks, in my estimation, to deal with Gaza and go on and stay on the defensive in the north. But what
about the long term? I get
the long term, right? I mean, we flip that question the other way, right? If this problem exists, what about the long term? And you have an American support we're seeing to begin to get chip away with the American public within the Democrat Party, things of that nature. So, yeah, that kind of the time frame. I just view it cuts both ways. If the Israelis leave this problem lingering, they got a long term problem too.
Sure, I agree with you. I think, look, the hug that the Biden administration gave the Israelis at the outset of the war increasingly looks like it was a bear hug, and we see almost from the outset a micromanagement of Israel's war effort. Let's not forget that the Israelis wanted to launch a ground invasion much earlier than they did, and that may have also spared civilian casualties on the Gazan side. But the delay in the ground invasion came because of pressure from the Biden administration. They were trying to pressure the Israelis, if I recall, not to launch one at all, but to at least delay one considerably. Look, I also understand that from United States point of view, you want to protect U.S. assets prior to this war being launched. So there is that consideration, obviously. But could this have been done differently, to where the Israelis could have finished by now? At least the major operations of the war. Rafah could have been subdued. Hamas, as an organized fighting force, not an insurgency, but an organized fighting force, could have been done. Yeah, I agree with you. By January, we've just been sitting around hearing about Rafah. The Israelis present a plan, and the administration keeps saying it's not enough. And who knows if that's true, or if it's just kind of the Biden administration. Every time the Israelis kind of reach the bar, they raise the bar.
Yeah. This is the time on this. Again, you here in the U.S., right? It gave time for the protest movement here on campuses to organize and to really culminate at a time when all attention is on campus, right? At graduation time. Just a lot of the time, the Israelis, they just don't do information operations well. And I just don't think they see the time horizons well on these issues. I think they had to go on their own at some point. And they pretty much are, right? They sealed off the Philadelphia corridor. They've begun operations in Rafah. So that's happening anyway. Why didn't it start in January? Even if it's a slow roll, right? They're not going in full force. It's happening right now. This is the thing that the Biden administration didn't want, even though it says that these operations haven't crossed the red line.
I think that, look, in an ideal world, you would have full U.S. backing.
Yes,
that
makes would be ideal.
Much easier. Look, and that's not, where you're talking about the international pressure ratcheting up, right? There's all the diplomatic pressure from Western countries. There's court cases, ICC, application for arrest warrants. This is part of the pressure that had this been done, had this been finished. I mean, this is something that President Biden mentioned in his speech the other day, that Israel's international isolation has increased. Well, dude, that's in large part because of you, in the sense that this is Israel's greatest ally. Everyone knows where Israel's bread is buttered. Everyone knows the degree to which, even again, Hassan Nasrallah can tell you the degree to which Israel depends on the United States. So if Israel's chief ally, its perceived protector, its backing, right, its ability, it's the country that enables it to go to war at all, and that protects it on the international scene, is basically like, we're out of this, you're on your own. Yeah, other people are going to pick up that message, and it's going to allow. Look, if you're a European country, for example, and you have these protests, right, on pro-Palestine protests trying to push you to take action against the Israelis among your public, and you have no counter pressure, meaning you don't have the United States saying, no, we're still giving our full-throated support to Israel. You don't have a balancing act to play there. Then you're just like, okay, well, I have to respond to my public because this is what's noisiest. This is what's happening now. Whereas if the United States were continuing to give that backing, it could act as a countervailing force. But it's not there, right? When Secretary Blinken says that Israel's on the way to making itself as illegitimate as Hamas, paraphrasing, but that's just why wouldn't everyone else?
What message is that sent domestically too, right? Like, has the Biden administration's policy towards Israel reinforced domestic opposition to Israel as well, right? You don't have the president of the United States standing up and defending Israel. You have the president of the United States and his Secretary of State demonizing Israel. Of course, you're going to get an element of, the American population, to, you're giving them credence. You're giving them legitimacy.
But also, you're giving them reason to continue pushing. You're giving them because as much as they're calling him Genocide Joe and all that, that's tactical. Because at the end of the day, if you realize this guy's not going to budge, he's actually not budging at all. All right, maybe you'll have some protests, then you give up. But if you see this guy buckling under the pressure, that's when you up the pressure. That's when you up the ante. That's when you continue, and you're like, well, let's keep calling him Genocide Joe because he responds to that. Right? He doesn't want to be called Genocide Joe.
I think this is a problem of our making here in the United States, of our political leadership, and then I think there's been poor political leadership in Israel as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot to blame. There's a lot of blame to be had there. I think the Israelis have scored a lot of own goals. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu's inability, unwillingness to bring his coalition, enforce discipline. I mean, a lot of these cases, the ICJ, ICC, are like based on statements made by loudmouths that don't reflect policy. But if you're looking for intent, right, sometimes all you have are statements like that. And, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, members of those coalitions, even some Likud members, right, rather than tell them, hey, shut up or you're out. And the maintenance of the coalition has overridden in that specific way the national interest. This is a problem.
It is, and guess who the warrant goes out for? Netanyahu, who refuses to request for a warrant. Let me be clear about that. He's the one to pay the price for it. That's the irony in all of that. David, thank you so much for joining me today. Excellent conversation. Certainly covered a lot of ground.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, Bill.
We got to get you back on soon, David. Thanks, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone, for listening to today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can listen to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe to Generation Jihad and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again real soon.